Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. This is 5x5 and I'm Simo. This will be my Wakanda Forever full spoiler review, so be warned, if you're not ready, if you haven't seen it, turn back now. So let's start with the story. It's pretty straightforward. There's no real twist in the movie really, other than the reveal of who ends up taking on the mantle of the Black Panther. The movie is about loss and grief and mourning someone that you've lost. T'Challa and Namor are forced to reveal themselves to Wakanda after an expedition in the ocean for vibranium leads the US to T'Challa, to Namor, to their hidden civilization. Namor's taking a more proactive approach to protecting his civilization. He's thinking, instead of, beefing up the border defenses, he's thinking conquer them before they conquer me because of his own past experiences. We'll get into that in a sec. But of course, the conflict that ensues forces Shuri to recreate the herb that empowers the Black Panther and then take up the legacy and the mantle of the Black Panther to protect Wakanda and by extension the world. So on the surface, what you might see is the threat of Namor invading Wakanda, but the real implied threat that's being set up that maybe a lot of people aren't going to necessarily catch on to is colonialization. It's imperialism. And that's what the very first court scene sets up. The idea being, if the US or France or the West in general is able to obtain vibranium, they become unstoppable. The only thing that's prevented them from full colonialization and imperialism is the vibranium that Wakanda has and its advanced technology and the advanced technology that vibranium allows for. And so the idea is, if we don't protect the vibranium both in Wakanda and in T'Challa, then the threat of colonialism and imperialism will eventually reach both of these nations' doorsteps. And history is on Namor's side for that. So that's the real threat. Even though most people might just kind of look at the action of the movie and go, oh, well, the threat is Namor invading Wakanda. Well, yes, and maybe the movie isn't entirely clear on that, but the real threat Namor is concerned about is the West getting vibranium, which will lead to further colonialism. Now, for my first impressions, I was really curious to see how this movie would go. It had a lot to live up to, really big boots to fill, because the first Black Panther was so culturally relevant and it resonated so much with the Black community, obviously, specifically. This was the first chance that Black Americans and, Black people all over the world got a chance to see a potential world of theirs that wasn't affected by colonialism and imperialism. So it had huge cultural relevance and resonance. So going into this movie, I was like, well, I'm really excited about this movie, but I'm afraid it's not going to live up to the same sort of relevance. And I do think a big part of the relevance of the first movie was timing too, because it came out at just the right time, or the wrong time is kind of a dubious distinction, where injustices in the US criminal justice system and police brutality were really being exposed on a very big scale. So the timing was really perfect. So the big question going into this movie for me was, is this movie going to have the same relevance? Because a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement activity that had happened around the release of the original Black Panther movie hasn't been happening for this one. And to answer that question, I don't think the movie has the same cultural relevance to the Black community. But that said, this is the first time that Indigenous Latin Americans get to see themselves in the same context without the effects of colonialism and imperialism. And I think that's really cool. I think little kids are going to see themselves on a big screen, and I think that's really special. But, and here's the but, I don't think that the issue of Indigenous Latin Americans is in the consciousness of North American audiences the same way the issues facing the Black community are. So in that sense, I think the movie is just as important, but I don't think it's going to have the same cultural relevance and resonance that the first movie had. the tone of this movie is a really nice change coming off of Thor 3 and coming off of She-Hulk. It's a much more serious tone. It's a much more somber tone owing to the context of the movie, owing to the subject matter of the movie, right? It's about grief and mourning. There's some comedic relief, but it's kept at a minimal to be very respectful for the grief and the mourning of the cast and the audience as well. So that's to be expected. And I think that really gets back to the source material of Marvel Comics as well. Traditionally, Marvel Comics have been very angsty. If you grew up reading X-Men specifically, or even the Avengers, or any of the large crossovers, they were really riddled with grief and loss and really big character development issues for characters. The idea was that Marvel Comics were written to be really relatable to kids and help them through, thinking through different issues and dealing with issues in their lives and whatnot. So they weren't terribly focused on being very light. And the movies, for the most part, have kind of tried to strike a balance between light and dark tones, at least up until this one. And this one, they don't hold back. They really lean into the darkness of grief and loss and mourning. I found the way they handled these issues totally relatable. I personally cried probably like 10 times in the movie. So, I mean, you might not be me, but I think they did a good job. I found the portrayal of these really raw emotions very relatable. They retconned the origin of Namor, and it really doubles down on exploring the cost of colonialism and imperialism that they started in the first Black Panther movie, and I think that's good. It's solid, and it's done really well. My inner comics nerd worries that they're opening up a can of worms, though, by retconning a historically and canonically relevant character like Namor, because retconning him, because he's such an old character, retconning him could end up breaking his continuity or whitewashing the historically racist context of the Jim Crow era that these characters existed in at the time, right? I'm not a Namor expert, though. So Namor purists may feel disenfranchised by the retcon. We'll see. Now, I don't want to just drop what I just said out of nowhere without some sort of explanation. So Black Adam recently came out and they race swapped Hawkman. Hawkman is a Golden Age character with a very long canonic history in DC Comics. So on one hand, great, we get representation. That's really awesome. But on the other hand, depending on how they handle the character's history and backstory, they can't possibly be a hero in the Golden Age of comics the way this character is historically. Because unfortunately, the Jim Crow era in the United States is really racist, so they would have never accepted a black superhero like Hawkman. So you can do it, but it really depends. Like with Black Adam and Hawkman, we don't know how DC is going to handle that character's history. So race swapping him is either going to end up destroying the character's legacy and really long canonic history, or they're going to have to come up with some other way to explain him as maybe being the second Hawkman or something like that. Or at best, I mean, what's the alternative? They kind of wave their hands and just pretend that the Jim Crow era of the United States didn't exist, and this black hero would just be accepted in that era, and people weren't really that racist. That's not really the reality, right? So it remains to be seen how that will work out for DC. But Namor may be something of the same situation because he is such an older legacy character. Now, that said, Namor doesn't have quite the same uphill battle because he has traditionally been portrayed as an anti-hero and an antagonist in a lot of his stories. So if he were to be retconned into an indigenous Latino, then it's not as big of a stretch for him to have a sort of like antagonistic history that can be referenced in his earlier stories because he'll be portrayed the same way in those stories as he is here. And now the retcon of his origin and ethnic background recontextualizes those stories in a really interesting way, I think. But mileage will vary. HBO's Watchmen TV series recently did something very similar a few years back when they did their show, and they handled it in a very brilliant way by making the character Hooded Justice another race-swapped character who had traditionally been portrayed as white in the comics. They retconned in the TV show that he was actually a black guy who had wore white makeup underneath his mask as a nod to the awareness of the Jim Crow era. The character was self-aware and meta-aware that he wouldn't be able to operate as a hero in the Jim Crow era as a black man, and he would be feared and he would be villainized. So he wore white makeup underneath his hero mask so that the public would see him as a white hero and accept him helping them and saving them. So if DC did something similar to that, or if Marvel does something similar to that, like that level of self-awareness and cleverness, they can get around doing race swaps for legacy characters that are like golden era heroes like that. But I don't think that they can if they don't get as honest and thoughtful about doing the retcons and the swaps as the HBO series did. And also, just in terms of the entire world building of Talokan and switching it from Atlantis to Talokan, I do think that Marvel panicked a little bit. It feels like they made some really quick decisions that weren't necessarily as well thought out as they usually are, or as we're used to seeing from Marvel, because they were trying to play catch up a little bit to DC's Aquaman movie, which was a really fun movie, very different tone of movie, but it was still a very fun movie. But because Aquaman and Namor are very similar, even though Namor came first, DC's Aquaman did come out a few years ago, and it covered a lot of the same origin and whatnot. So I do feel like Marvel kind of panicked a little bit and tried to make some changes to freshen up and contemporize Namor. But some of the decisions may have been just a little bit rushed and not as well thought out as we had hoped, or as we're used to seeing from Marvel. Now let's talk about the characters. Shuri is amazing. Letitia Wright gives an amazing performance. I was stunned by how much I was in love with this character. I loved Shuri in the first movie, and watching her go through all the emotions and go through all the feelings of loss and grief and anger, and explored in such a raw and relatable way was just really impressive. It was something to see. We never really see grief and anger explored in this way in mainstream media. There's always this kind of waving of the hand when we lose people, you know. So the character will have like a minor outburst, but then settle into just being compliant and sad because that's what's more comfortable for everyone else around the character. And in real life, it's kind of this pressure to go through your grief and not like rock the boat and sort of not necessarily experience grief in the most authentic way for the sake of the comfort of the people around you. So it's really interesting to see the grief of Shuri explored in a much more authentic way in this movie. And it's even more rare in the portrayal of marginalized communities because, of course, marginalized communities are always tone policed, right? If you're Black or a woman or you're one of the gays, you know, the expectation is that you go along to get along. And anger and dissent and argumentativeness and conflict are very socially discouraged in these marginalized communities. So it's very rare to see that here, and I think that was also a very cool and very special thing to see. I really liked Namor. His performance was solid. I think they do a really good job making him a sympathetic villain the same way they did with Killmonger. And I think I think the audience is even able to be even more invested in him than they were in Killmonger. To some extent, I think in the first Black Panther 2, I don't think they anticipated the audience being as invested in Killmonger as they ended up being. And in Namor, they take that to the next step. They take that up a notch. His cause is definitely righteous and inarguably valid. The Queen's performance was amazing. I wouldn't be surprised if Angela Bassett gets an Oscar for her performance in the throne room when she's talking to Okoye. That scene was heartbreaking and devastating all at once. I felt every word, every tear in my bones. I cannot stress enough. Like I was shocked by how hard that scene hit me, and I felt for Okoye, and I felt for the Queen, and I cried again, and I cried again. Now, I feel like I've been pretty praising in the movie. I did have some issues with the movie. It's not a perfect movie. So I did have some issues. Let's go through some of them. First things first, can we talk about the bracelet? Oh man, that bracelet, the moment they showed us in the flashback what it was made from, I knew exactly how it was going to be used. It was just very predictable, and I don't mind sort of predictable plot points. I feel like I'm pretty good at predicting plot points, but this was just so obvious. It was a little disappointing that it was so obvious that I feel like it's worth being called out. Of course, the movie is really long. When you sit down from the ads at the beginning of the movie to the actual movie itself, it's a good 2 hours and 45 minutes, and some of that could have been trimmed out. I enjoyed all of the subplots, but some of them really felt forced, and they felt like they were just put in to launch the next part of the franchise. And that's fine. I don't mind some sort of tie-ins and stuff. But in this case, I do feel like they went a little too far, and they were more concerned with making this connect to the next installments of the franchise than they were in maintaining the integrity of the movie. I don't think that it hurt or ruined the movie, but I do think that this kind of forced cross-marketing really, it doesn't ruin the movie, but it does hold the movie back from being truly excellent. Another issue I had was with the conflict of the story. It felt a little weird when I stood back and thought about it, to think about how essentially we have this Afrofuturism Black community, and then we have this Indigenous futurism, Indigenous Latin American community at odds and in conflict with each other. And I couldn't help but feel like this is kind of what the systems of oppression want. They want the marginalized groups to be fighting with each other instead of fighting with the system up here, right? So I couldn't help but notice that and feel like it was a little bit like ill-considered, but at the same time, we tend to fall into infighting within our groups against each other instead of the systems of oppression. So in that way, it was a little bit realistic. So to wrap up, I think Wakanda Forever is a great movie. It's fantastic. It feels a little forced at times and it drags on a bit, but I don't think that ruins it. It just keeps it from being an exceptional, incredible movie the way it could be. It's still a very good movie, and it's worth your time to go see. If you like the first Black Panther and you're invested in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I think you're going to like this movie. On the other hand, if your eyes roll every time someone says colonialism or imperialism, you're probably going to run out of this movie raging and need to go to like a Trump rally or something like that after. So if that's you, maybe you could just sit this one out. That's a wrap for now. Don't forget to click like and subscribe. I'll see you all in the next video. Stay safe and look out for each other.